The EU is one of the biggest investors in Asia. They are the biggest investor in Taiwan, and ASEAN countries see them as a very reliable partner, one of the highest ranked in their list of possible partners. So trade, a huge proportion of EU trade goes through this region. So investments, security of the sea lines of communication, so the SLOCs, that's really key to Europe. Anything that happens there will really affect Europe, so I think they're interested not only in the possibility of trade, but also the interruption of trade. And the other issue on climate change, all of these countries are experiencing very significant issues in regard to climate change. So we're seeing a little bit of backtracking within the EU. They've all come up with the great legislation and directives, but in reality now the public, post-COVID economic landscape, in addition to the war in Ukraine, which has increased the price of energy and also food costs, has made the public very difficult. It's difficult to keep them on board of these green rules and regulations, and everyone knows how hard it is to get 27 EU member states to agree to something. So this is something that we have to navigate through, and and they need to continue to show leadership. So I think that that's being whittled away. And it's very important for the Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, climate change, because a lot of these smaller countries are really experiencing that. So I think the EU should continue to try to show leadership in this, but we see it will be a very difficult way forward. I would say the People's Republic of China, under Xi Jinping, this is his signature foreign policy. So it's quite dynamic because he is attempting, first time in history really, to tie land corridors with sea corridors. So you have the land as well as the sea, and usually strategists choose one or the other. So it's a very, very ambitious plan. In the early days, they had very deep pockets, but the BRI investments kind of peaked in 2016, 2017. And since then, even some bankers were kind of arrested. They were not allowed to leave the People's Republic of China because there were suspicions that there was corruption. But in reality, in some cases, it was that they just didn't have such great experience in making these overseas loans. So yes, there were levels of corruption, but there was also a steep learning curve. I call a lot of these abandoned projects, we would call them white elephants, but because they were done with communist money, we call them red elephants. So there's a lot of over-investment, overspending, and learning the hard way. But in other countries, there have been real success stories. So taken all together, I think China's constantly learning and tweaking the program. But the fact that they've decided to retire the name of the Belt and Road Initiative means it's a bit tarnished. So we have the Global Development Initiative, and it means it's the entire world. The BRI, initially, the idea was to connect Asia with Europe, but with the Global Development Initiative, it's really around the world, and it's also to address what some like to call the Global South. So they're really stepping up investment in infrastructure in South America. That's where the Silk Road really would have never existed, and Africa, we've seen huge increase of investments there. Kind of the dark side of all of this is what some have characterized as debt trap diplomacy. There are two views on this. One is that the Chinese didn't really have a serious plan to trap countries into this type of debt. But the first example of this might have been Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. And they had been warned that this was a very unworkable project. Nevertheless, because of some of the leadership, they wanted this project. So the port, and in addition an airport, but they were unable to pay back the loans. And so there was a debt for equity swap, and the strategic port of Hambantota is now under Chinese control for 100 years. There's a 100-year lease on that. So other countries are very concerned about this, and Beijing is really reluctant to do any sort of debt forgiveness. Now there's a lot of effort by other countries saying, in Africa, for example, there's a lot of investments in rail projects, road projects, but they're expected to pay back that money, and Beijing is expecting that to be paid back. But because of this dire economic climate post-COVID, plus increase in inflation because of the war in Ukraine, they're asked, these are non-performing loans, these countries in Africa, for example, are unable to service the debt. And so Beijing doesn't want to have any debt relief. A lot of these agreements were done under the table or secret, so we don't know what's in them. And so the idea of having debt relief would mean that they would have to show what the agreements look like. There is a program, Aid Data, that has kind of been able to look at all of these contracts or to accumulate many of them and publish them so other countries realize what they're getting into. And sometimes just very basic grassroots things like having lawyers to look at the fine print of these contracts might help countries avoid this debt trap. Now, it doesn't matter if that was China's plan or if it wasn't, the outcome is the same. They're demanding debt for equity. And that means that they might, we're seeing their first overseas base is in Djibouti, which is in Africa, and now they want another base on the west side of Africa. So many analysts are questioning, are they going to do another equity swap in order to get a base? So this is something, China has a growing second biggest economy in the world. They've invested a great deal in their military. So will we see this also translate into bases overseas? So this is what everyone's watching. But in this new form, the Global Development Initiative, the GDI, doesn't have as deep pockets as it did in the past, in large part because the Chinese economy is slowing down as well. So I think that many countries look to Beijing thinking there's a lot of over-promising and under-delivering, but in some areas I think it's forcing the rest of the countries, the West especially, which has been rather complacent on infrastructure building, to at least have an offer so that not the only offer on the table is the Chinese offer. Therefore, they can kind of improve what they can offer and offer more transparency. So we see the Europeans offering global gateway. Japan has been very active also in building infrastructure, but it's hard to get private sector matching funds for infrastructure. And a lot of these Western plans, especially Global Gateway, which is an initiative of the European Union, is expecting private investment in this as well. And as we know with the Eurostar, which has been around for many years, and it's a very useful rail route from continental Europe to the UK, it doesn't make any money. So it's hard to make money out of infrastructure, and often they need the deep pockets of governments to pay for it. I think after 1989, we all kind of took a holiday from history. Everyone was so happy, the wall came down, everything was going to be groovy and great and happy, and no one really thought about geopolitics anymore. The idea that the end of history had come and no one needed to worry about this type of competition. And we also saw globalization. So no one was really considering the strategic landscape for investments. And that really transformed how we see the world. And it's difficult for companies to start thinking geopolitically again, because that's a muscle they haven't exercised in about 30 years. And so I would say geoeconomics and geopolitics are back with great power. And I think that this type of competition between an authoritarian regime and the democracy is really coming to a head. We never saw this coming, which I think is not good. We had our own blinders on, and the idea that if we engage with an authoritarian regime, that they would become more like the West and become more democratic the more we traded with them has proven to be an empty promise. And the one thing we're beginning to understand, and that we're beginning to learn, that trading with an authoritarian regime doesn't change them, it changes us. So this has imported corruption into our system, and it's also eroded democratic institutions. So we really require vigilance and to wake up to what's really happening. But it's difficult because even the narrative of de-risking is fraught. Many companies are making plenty of money in China. Other companies have had their intellectual property stripped from them, and they're no longer needed by the Chinese Communist Party, so they're exiting China. So it depends where you are on the food chain. If you can offer them high-level technology, you're still welcome in China, whereas other companies really can't make money in China. And since the 1800s, even the mills in England dreamt of selling shirts to China with the huge population. So I think the idea of 1.4 billion possible consumers can't be wrong, but we're seeing that China, for the past 10 years has been decoupling from the rest of the world, making the rest of the world more dependent on them and them less dependent on the rest of the world. So they're way ahead of us. They have strategic foresight, and I think that they're maybe the only country in the world that's had a strategy for the last 30 years.